do. The psychological impact of such a case is enormous, as can be discovered from the discussion between the questioner and this witness, for whom the incident still has a dreamlike quality many years after the sighting. The loss of time is reminiscent of the Betty Hill case examined in the previous chapter. The argument among the men as to whether or not the rifle had been taken out of the car is amazing. These witnesses had, in fact, lost their sense of reality. They had gone beyond the edge, entered an alternate world. The visitation by official-looking men the next day made matters even worse. As we say in Chapter 2, this is not an isolated case. What did these men see? What is the nature of an apparition? These questions formed the basis for the next discussion between the authors, with psychologist Dr. Arthur Hastings again sitting in. Discussing this case, one of us raised the question of its physical nature. Hastings: Let me comment on apparitions briefly. You're right that most apparitions are very real. In fact, most people don't know they're seeing apparitions until they've disappeared or walked through a wall. Sometimes, however, they don't have any feet. Did you know that? Hynek: No, I didn't know that. Hastings: Sometimes a person will be asked, how did it react? What was it wearing on its feet? And the person will think for a moment and suddenly say, it didn't have any feet. Hynek: But on the other hand, a British scientist named Maxwell Cade — Maxwell Cade is the scientist with whom Dr. Hynek conducted the hypnosis experiment related in Chapter 4 — told me that in post-hypnotic suggestions you can say that at this party Miss So-and-so will be there, and this person sees her there, and when he is asked later what she was wearing, he will make up what kind of dress she had on, and, on a man, what colored tie he had. They improvise. So I don't see why they wouldn't improvise here, too, unless it struck them very hard that it didn't have any feet. Hastings: I'm assuming they're seeing something real, something that's genuinely there. In hypnosis, you can't say they're making up that, because for all you know, they saw a person standing there wearing these kinds of clothes. When I ask people to hallucinate little black dogs, so far as I can tell, they see a little black dog with a head and a tail. Hynek: Yes, but did you ask them, did it have a collar? Will they improvise a collar? Hastings: How do you know they're improvising if they say it has a collar? Now, Tyrrell, a leading British psychical researcher, thinks apparitions are not things that are physically there in any sort of submatter form, but are rather created by stimulation of the sensory system inside the person. Hynek: Well, if they are apparitions, they're apparitions that can produce tangible effects. Hastings: The apparitions in the classical occult literature do not produce physical effects. They don't drop handkerchiefs or knock over things with their elbows. Valet: They don't usually cause macroscopic effects, although they may wither flowers or leave a strange odor or... Hastings: Change the temperature. Valet: Cause a draft of air. Hynek: Well, I've got to tell you now the story I was going to tell you at dinner the other night. I have a friend who has a strong interest in the Hopi Indians and the Kachina dolls. The Kachina dolls are supposed to be representatives of the Sky People, the gods of outer space. When I was in Bottineau, North Dakota, in this very isolated place, I met a historian of Indian cultures who started to tell me some stories of the Indians. All tribes have these stories of Sky People, not only in the Hopi culture, but also the Sioux and others. The Sioux, for instance, state that when the Sky People left, They changed themselves into arrows and went off into the sky. Well, so did Neil Armstrong change himself into an arrow when he got in his rocket and went off. We got talking about medicine men. He was telling me that he'd been accepted into the Indian culture. He has done the sun dances with them, and he told me of 2 instances of clairvoyance. In one case, an Indian named Redhorn was one of 3 young bucks who were drowned. They found the bodies of 2 of them, but Redhorn was not found, and so they did the wind-shaking dance. They have another name, but this guy calls it that. He said there is a long involved dance and ceremony. Then the Great Spirit comes. There is a very real wind that just zooms through the village and slams doors, and the medicine man says, "The Great Spirit is here." One sideline. For some reason, some of the younger members of the tribe that were going to perform this dance wanted this Catholic priest to witness the thing. And when the Great Spirit came, the Catholic priest cried out in pain. Later, he said he felt that every bone in his body was broken, and they just laughed and said, "Well, that's what the Great Spirit does to those who don't believe." There was no permanent injury, but it knocked the hell out of him. And then, after a number of minutes, the Great Spirit left. There was a wind in the other direction, and the medicine man said, "The Great Spirit is gone." The instructions that the medicine man gave to the family of Redhorn were to watch for 3 large birds. They were to follow these birds. At a certain point, 2 birds would turn off, and 1 would go straight. They were to follow the one that went straight, and they would find the body of Redhorn. So they alerted everybody to watch for the birds, and they came. 2 did turn off, and 1 went straight, and suddenly a shot rang out, and then 1 fell down. The Indians didn't shoot it. Somebody else. Nobody knows who did. But somebody shot it, and it came down, and right under where it fell in the water, they found Redhorn's body. Another case, he told me, was where a young Indian had had a very valuable saddle stolen. So they again had a ceremony, and finally the medicine man said that on a certain day, and he specified the day, this buck was to go out along the river until he saw a coyote sitting on a bluff. He was to dig under that bluff, right where the coyote had been sitting, and he would find his saddle. And he did. Now, of course, those things are pretty hard to believe, in a sense. On the other hand, how do we know? Hastings. Yes, well, they're certainly consistent. It is interesting that our clairvoyants tend to describe the locale. There's a bluff with a certain kind of rock under which, but to follow 3 birds, that's something else. Hynek. Well, this is very much like Carlos Castaneda's journey to Ixtlan, where he has the power or he doesn't have the power, and he is always looking for signs, for a swallow to fly a certain way, and that sort of thing. Valet. I have heard of a local healer in Normandy who is also a clairvoyant. Someone lost a sheep and went to see him. He described the locale by remote viewing. He said he saw a river, a bend in a river, and some trees and a depression, and he saw the sheep there. That wasn't in the area that the owner of the sheep knew, so he asked around if anyone knew an area like that, and the people said there was such a place 10 miles in such a direction. He went there and found the sheep. But it was a case of remote viewing again. There was no sign. One thing that bothers me whenever this subject of links with the occult comes up is a curious tendency on the part of even the most knowledgeable of those people to reject UFOs just as scientists do. For instance, you approach the subject of UFOs with people who are into the Kabbalah or astrology, alchemy, spiritualism, or other esoteric topics. These are very well-established disciplines with certain hierarchies of subjects. But whenever you mention UFOs, they just don't fit into any of their existing categories. There is no occult school that has a tradition of UFOs. They are just as baffled about it as the rationalists, and they tend to reject it with the same kind of skepticism. In other words, you find the same kind of skepticism in the high priests of the occult as you find in the high priests of science. Hastings: That's quite true. Absolutely true. Now, why is that? The behavior of the UFOs, the technology, might have some similarities, but the behavior, the intelligence, and the occupants absolutely have no place in any of the occult traditions. Hynek: But what about the humanoids? If you're going to say they resemble anything, it seems to me, if I were pressed to that, I would say they resemble large versions of the little people, or sometimes the things that are called elementals in the occult literature. Valet: Yes, but there really is no occult tradition about contact with the little people. There are Rosicrucian theories of contact with elementals, but elementals and the little people, the elves and leprechauns of Celtic lore, are two different things. Hastings: That's true. Sometimes the little people are seen, but that's about it. Valet: A good example is that celebrated magician Aleister Crowley. One day in Switzerland, he saw a little creature, and it was clear to him it was not an elemental, and he had no idea what it was. Hynek: How are we defining elemental now? In most of the traditional occult literature, elementals are said to be creatures in the etheric realm and or astral domain. An elemental frequently can be created by a person and infused with his own emotion and becomes an actual creation of this person, whereas the little people supposedly represent another scheme of evolution, another life wave that is not connected with the human race. Some occult literature terms these salamanders, undines, sylphs, elementals too. Confusing. Well, there we are. What a strange...
I am sorry, Noah.
You were looking out for your own. I can't even be angry at you for that.
On my home world, we believe that the battle with darkness will continue till all are one. I lost sight of that. You fought for yours as I fought for mine, when we should have been fighting the darkness together.
Well, I ain't done fighting yet.